Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through 130 hidden secrets buried deep inside Elden Ring's sorcery system. Spells you've likely walked past, mechanics that the game never bothered to explain, and build combinations that make the lands between feel like an entirely different game. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The Azure Staff in your offhand. Most sorcerers who find Azure's glintstone staff make the same mistake. They see it has lower damage scaling than Lusat's and tuck it into their inventory, never touching it again. But there is a hidden mechanic sitting inside that staff that rewards the players who understand how passive staff bonuses actually work. When you hold Azure's glintstone staff in your offhand, meaning you are casting with an entirely different staff in your right hand, the speed reduction bonus still applies. The faster casting time that Azure's staff grants is calculated as a character level stat, essentially acting like additional dexterity added directly to your tarnished. So any staff you cast with benefits from it. You get quicker animations, reduced cast time on all of your spells, and you do not have to pay the FP penalty since you are casting from your other staff. It is one of the most elegant hidden interactions in the game, and once you understand it, you begin to see why the most optimized intelligence builds almost always run 2 staves simultaneously, rather than 1. The Lusat rule. Only the casting hand gains. Lusat's glintstone staff is the highest scaling sorcery catalyst in Elden Ring, hitting sorcery scaling of 413 at maximum upgrade with 80 intelligence. And it holds a special place in every min-maxed sorcerer's arsenal. But there is a companion misunderstanding that trips people up constantly. While Azure's speed bonus works passively from the offhand, Lusat's damage bonus absolutely does not. If you hold Lusat's staff in your left hand and cast with a different staff in your right, you pay 50% more FP on every spell and gain absolutely 0 additional damage. The raw damage multiplication only applies when Lusat's staff is the one you are actively casting from. This is because damage scaling is weapon-specific in the calculation engine. It reads the sorcery scaling of whatever implement you fire the spell from, not whatever you happen to be holding. Keep this distinction sharp in your mind when planning your loadout. Lusat goes in your casting hand, and it costs dearly in FP, but the payoff in raw numbers is the highest ceiling available to any pure intelligence build. The Meteorite Staff secret, never upgraded. Very early in the game, players who know their way around Elden Ring's starting areas will make a beeline through Caelid to the swamp of Aeonia, where a corpse hanging out of a second-story window holds the Meteorite Staff. It requires only 18 intelligence, has an inherent plus 30% damage boost to all gravity sorceries, and hits remarkably hard straight out of the ground. But here is what makes it more useful than its modest appearance suggests. The Meteorite Staff cannot be upgraded at all. It only takes somber smithing stones and has no upgrade path. This means most players discard it the moment a better staff comes along. The correct approach, however, is to keep it forever. Because the plus 30% gravity bonus is a passive property that activates simply by equipping it in either hand, you can hold it in your offhand while casting every gravity sorcery from a much higher scaling staff in your dominant hand. You get the Meteorite specialty bonus stacked on top of your main staff's damage scaling simultaneously. 2 staves, 2 different bonuses, 1 build. The night comet nobody dodges. Somewhere hidden in the fog of Celia, town of sorcery, behind a magical barrier that only drops when you light a specific brazier atop a southwest tower, sits a chest containing one of the most quietly devastating spells in the entire game. Night Comet looks, on paper, like a weaker version of the Glintstone Comet Shard. It has lower listed damage, and its description doesn't hint at anything unusual. What the description doesn't tell you is that Night Comet is semi-invisible. Its projectile travels through the air in a way that enemy AI simply cannot register as an incoming threat. And this is not a minor quirk. It means that every single non-player enemy in the game, including most bosses, will never, under any circumstances, attempt to dodge it. You can stand at range, chaincast Night Comet over and over, and watch enemies that would sidestep a regular comet just absorb every shot. Load into the game tonight and try this. Pick the most evasive enemy you have been frustrated by. Night Comet turns that fight into a completely different experience. The Staff of Loss offhand. Amplifier. Now that you know about Night Comet, you need to know about its best companion piece. The Staff of Loss is a staff with unremarkable base sorcery scaling, not something you would ever want to actively cast from. But it carries a passive ability that changes the math entirely. When equipped, the Staff of Loss boosts Night Shard and Night Comet by 30%. This means that simply by holding the Staff of Loss in your offhand, every cast of Night Comet deals 30% more damage, and you never have to touch the staff itself or cast from it. Equipping 2 Staves of Loss, one in each hand, stacks the bonus multiplicatively, which is only possible in New Game Plus, or by trading with another player, since only one staff exists per playthrough. With that full setup, Night Comet outperforms virtually every other sorcery in the game on a per cast per FP basis in sustained combat. The Staff of Loss is found in Celia, town of sorcery in Caelid, arm on a corpse resting on a rooftop balcony, accessible by jumping across the buildings via torrent. It sits in the same town as Night Comet itself, which feels appropriate given how naturally the two belong together. The Invisible Tower and the Assassin spells. Altus Plateau holds a secret that the game barely gestures at, and most players walk right past it. On your map, a location called Mirage Rise shows up with an icon suggesting a tower. But when you go there, nothing is there. The tower is completely invisible. To make it appear, you must find and touch 3 phantom crests hidden across the surrounding plateau. One near an imp statue, one to the south guarded by spawning ghost imps, and one that requires striking an illusory rock to reveal. Only after touching all 3 does the tower materialize where the map said it would be. Climb its interior ladder in the dark, and the chest at the top holds both Unseen Form and Unseen Blade. Unseen Form makes your entire character and your horse Torrent partially invisible to enemies, reducing detection range dramatically. Unseen Blade, on the other hand, renders your right-hand weapon completely invisible. Stack both spells, ride Torrent into a camp of sleeping enemies, and experience Elden Ring as a full stealth game that was hiding inside the fantasy combat won the entire time. Shard Spiral and the multi-hit secret. Most players who encounter Shard Spiral dismiss it quickly. It appears to fire 2 spiraling bolts that travel slowly toward a target, and against smaller enemies, it looks underwhelming. What is not immediately obvious is that the bolts do not stop when they reach their target. They pass through the enemy, continuing to deal damage at intervals for their full travel duration. And against a large enough target, this turns into a remarkable number of hits per cast. Against massive bosses, the Elden Beast, Placidusax, Fire Giant, the bolts spend their entire range, traveling through an enormous hitbox, landing hit after hit for only 14 FP. Each individual instance deals meaningful magic damage. A charged version amplifies each of those hits. Players who discovered this mid-playthrough report the moment as genuinely jaw-dropping. The Elden beast. That enormous cosmic leviathan simply melting under a barrage of twin bolts that the spell's description gives no hint of. Purchase this from sorceress Selen after progressing her questline and choosing to side with her rather than Jeren. The physics of gravity. Well, gravity, sorceries in Elden Ring get discussed mostly in terms of Rocksling's physical damage and the meteorite staff's passive bonus. But Gravity Well and Collapsing Stars have a mechanic that goes almost entirely unappreciated. Both spells pull enemies toward you, not damage them and then pull them, not subtly nudge them. Actively drag them through the air in a fairly committed arc toward your position. In most encounters, this feels like a curiosity, but in environments with ledges, drops, and environmental hazards, it becomes something else entirely. In Miquella's Hallig Tree, a location notorious for its precarious walkways and aggressive enemies, Gravity Well trivializes numerous fights by simply yanking enemies off elevated platforms before combat even properly begins. The small flying enemies that patrol the branches can be pulled into open air and sent plummeting. It works on most non-boss enemies and even functions on some mid-tier mini-bosses, and the animation of an armored knight being pulled helplessly across the air never stops feeling satisfying. Terra Magica, the ground beneath your feet. Somewhere in the Academy, Crystal Cave, past a double boss fight against two Crystallians and up a ladder to a rooftop, sits one of the most powerful support sorceries in the entire game. Terra Magica creates a glowing sigil on the ground centered on your cast position, and for 30 seconds anyone standing within it gains a 35% boost to all magic damage. Not sorceries specifically, all magic damage. Your spells hit harder. Your magic-infused weapons hit harder. Even certain incantation-based magic breaths benefit from it. The strategic use of this spell fundamentally reshapes how you approach boss fights. Before any major confrontation, cast Terra Magica in a corner of the arena you plan to fight in. Walk into the sigil, and every subsequent spell you land carries 35% more weight. Stack it with Magic Shrouding Crack Tear from your Flask of Wondrous Physic, the Magic Scorpion Charm Talisman, and the Graven Mass Talisman, and the multiplicative damage amplification becomes almost surreal. The boss that took you 15 attempts drops in 3. Rocksling, the physical damage sorcery. There is a long-standing assumption in Elden Ring that intelligence builds deal magic damage. This is largely true, but Rocksling exists as a quietly important exception that carries an enormous practical weight. Rocksling is a gravity sorcery that tears chunks of earth out of the ground and hurls them at enemies, and the damage type is 100% physical. Not split, not partial, purely physical. This matters because every region of the game contains enemies with elevated magic resistance but ordinary physical defense, and sorcerers who only pack magic damage spells suddenly find themselves starved for options. With Rocksling, you never face that wall. Crystallian enemies in the Academy, who absorb magic damage almost entirely, buckle under Rocksling's boulders. Magic-resistant bosses like Astel, natural-born of the Void, who is largely immune to his own element, take full punishment from Throne Earth. The spell is available immediately in Caelid, inside an underground cellar north of the Street of Sages ruins, and it only requires 18 intelligence to use. The casting speed, hidden stat. Elden Ring never explains this directly, but dexterity controls how fast your character casts all spells. Every point of dexterity up to 70 makes your spells come out marginally faster, shaving frames off cast animations and recovery windows. The game tells you dexterity affects attack speed for certain weapons, but it does not announce its role in spellcasting at all. For an intelligence build, this creates a quiet decision. Invest in dexterity purely for casting speed, or find an item substitute. The Radagon Icon Talisman solves this problem by granting the equivalent of 30 virtual dexterity toward cast speed only, without affecting weapon scaling or requiring you to split your stat budget. When you hold the Radagon icon and equip Azur's Glintstone Staff in your offhand simultaneously, the combined effect pushes you to the 70 dexterity casting speed cap, regardless of how many points you have actually spent in that attribute. It is one of the cleaner examples of Elden Ring rewarding players who read item descriptions carefully and connect dots. The game never draws for you. The Comet Azur one-shot setup. Comet Azur is perhaps the most famous sorcery in the game, a beam of concentrated primeval energy that channels continuously as long as you hold the button. Most players who find it from Primeval Sorcerer Azur on the slopes of Mount Gelmir try it once. Notice it obliterates their FP bar instantly and struggle to get much use from it. The setup for turning it into a legitimate one-shot boss tool is built from 4 separate pieces that almost nobody assembles on their first run. First, cast Terra Magica on the ground and step into the sigil for the 35% magic boost. Second, drink a flask of Wondrous Physic containing the Cerulean Hidden Tear, which eliminates FP consumption entirely for approximately 10 seconds. Third, use the Magic Shrouding Crack Tear to simultaneously stack a 20% magic damage bonus. Fourth, cast Comet Azur from a position where the boss cannot interrupt you, often using a spirit summon to hold aggro, and hold the channel button through the full duration. With Lusas staff and proper talisman setup, this combination can kill most bosses before the FP free window closes. Ranni's Dark Moon, the opener, not the finisher. A significant portion of players who obtain Ranni's Dark Moon treat it as a damage spell. They cast it hoping to watch its magic frost orb decimate a boss in one hit, are disappointed by the damage relative to its enormous FP cost, and conclude it is overrated. The misunderstanding is about the spell's purpose. Ranni's Dark Moon is an opener. It dispels any sorceries that touch it as it travels, clearing incoming enemy spells from the air. When it hits an enemy, it applies a debuff that increases magic damage taken by 10%, lasting for roughly 60 seconds, the same percentage as Renala's Full Moon, though Ranni's uniquely also inflicts Frostbite build-up. When Frostbite procs simultaneously, the combined debuff stacks multiplicatively into a larger magic vulnerability. Every sorcery you land during that window deals more effective damage as a result of the debuff. The intended use is to open a boss fight by landing the Dark Moon, triggering the debuff, and following with your highest damage sustained spells for the duration. Worth noting, some players have reported the debuff appears bugged in certain patches, using PvP-tuned values in PvE. So against some enemies, the practical benefit may feel smaller than intended. Against enemies susceptible to frost, Ranni's Dark Moon's Frostbite buildup is still a meaningful advantage over Renala's version regardless of the debuff percentage. The Snow Witch Hat and the Hidden Buff. Ranni's questline rewards you with the Snow Witch set, an elegant, long-witched hat of deep purple wool that suited the phantom sorceress who wore it. Most players who complete the quest line appreciate it aesthetically. What fewer notice is that the hat carries a 10% damage boost to Ranni's Dark Moon, while the Carian Regal Scepter Staff provides a separate 10% boost to all full moon sorceries, including the Dark Moon. Because these bonuses are multiplicative rather than additive, equipping both items together raises the Dark Moon's effective output by approximately 21% compared to casting it bare. Pair that with the 60-second magic negation debuff the spell applies, and the combination of Snow Witch Hat, Carian Regal Scepter, and a committed opening sequence turns Ranni's signature spell from a nice-to-have into a cornerstone of an extremely effective late-game magic build. The hat can be found in a chest inside Ranni's Rise once you've progressed to the appropriate point in her storyline. Carian's Slicer. 4 FP, full devastation. If you have only ever played a ranged sorcerer in Elden Ring, you may not have given Carian's Slicer a second look. It conjures a magical sword and delivers a sweeping slash. Melee range, no tracking, no range. But consider the numbers. It costs 4 FP per cast. 4. The damage multiplier is 1.8 times your sorcery scaling per swing, and it can be chain cast without the recovery gap that most spells suffer. The animation chains so quickly that at high intelligence, with the Carian Glintstone Staff in your offhand for its 15% passive bonus to Carian melee sorceries, a dedicated slicer build can sustain DPS that rivals or exceeds ranged sorceries while spending dramatically less FP per burst window. The Royal House Scroll, found on a corpse at ruins east of Agil Lake South, unlocks it for purchase from Selen, Miriel, or Seluvis for 1500 runes. Get that scroll early, buy Carian Slicer, and you will have a tool that stays relevant from the first dungeon all the way to the final boss. The Carian Glintstone Staff. Passive. Every time you equip the Carian Glintstone Staff, a weapon that requires 24 intelligence and can be found by following a specific path through the Korea Manor rooftop, you are granting yourself a 15% damage boost to all Carian melee sorceries. Carian Slicer, Carian Greatsword, Carian Piercer, and Adula's Moonblade all receive this buff simply from the staff being in your loadout. You do not have to cast from it. You do not have to have it equipped in your main hand. The passive triggers from either hand. This creates a dual staff setup that experienced casters use to cover every school simultaneously. Lusat's Glintstone Staff or Carian Regal Scepter in the casting hand for maximum sorcery scaling. Carian Glintstone Staff in the offhand for the melee sorcery boost. And suddenly every option in your spell list operates at close to full effectiveness. The setup rewards players who understand that offhand items are not deadweight in Elden Ring. They are a second layer of build optimization. Adula's Moonblade and the double hit, the Glintstone Dragon. Adula guards the Cathedral of Manoseles in the Moonlight Altar, one of the most remote and visually breathtaking locations in all of Leonia. Defeating her rewards you with Adula's Moonblade, a Carian sorcery that swings an enormous phantom greatsword in a wide arc before firing a frost projectile from the blade tip. What the spell doesn't announce is that these are two separate hit events. The melee portion of the swing and the frost projectile that follows are registered individually, meaning that an enemy caught at close range takes both the physical contact damage and the projectile damage in rapid succession. Against large or slow enemies at close-medium distance, this effectively doubles Adula's damage output compared to landing only one hit. The spell also benefits from the Carian Glintstone Staff passive and the Snow Witch Hats. 10% Frost Sorcery boost, and it builds Frostbite. making it a versatile offensive tool that punishes anything that stands its ground. Stars of Ruin and the 12 Homing Bolts. Stars of Ruin is Master Lusad's legendary spell, found within Celia Hideaway in Caelid behind an illusory wall that even experienced players sometimes fail to find. Lusad himself sits petrified in a hidden chamber deeper in the cave, accessible only after Sorceress Selen gives you the Celian Seal Breaker key as part of her questline. The spell fires 12 tracking projectiles simultaneously, all of which independently home in on the nearest enemy and adjust their flight paths as the target moves. Against a stationary or slow-moving target, all 12 tend to land, resulting in a staggering burst of magic damage against fast-moving, erratic bosses who sidestep regular sorceries constantly, the kinds of enemies that make a pure caster's life miserable. Stars of Ruin removes the problem entirely. You cast it and let the stars handle navigation. The tracking is aggressive enough that even the most evasive bosses in the game struggle to escape a full 12-bolt barrage, and it only costs 40 FP for that entire volley. The Frostbite, trigger, and what it actually does. Frostbite is one of the most underexplained status effects in Elden Ring, and because the game never clearly tells you what proccing it does, many players treat it as damage over time and move on. When Frostbite triggers on an enemy, two things happen simultaneously. The enemy takes a burst of flat damage scaled to a percentage of their maximum health, and their damage negation is reduced. Specifically, they take more damage from all sources, physical, magic, fire, all of it, for the duration. This means that the ideal strategy for any enemy susceptible to frost is not to treat Frostbite as your damage source. It is to use Frostbite as a setup tool, triggering it with a cheap build-up spell like Glintstone Icecrag or Ranni's Dark Moon, and then immediately following with your highest damage burst spell during the window when the enemy is taking additional damage. Against something that can be repeatedly frostbitten, this cycle becomes one of the most efficient damage loops in the game. The Ambush, shard that fires backwards. Ambush Shard is a knight sorcery that looks almost completely unremarkable at first glance. It fires a small magic projectile that deals decent damage and costs 8 FP. Players who pick it up in the underground jail of the Witchbane ruins in Weeping Peninsula tend to use it a few times, find it deals less damage than their main sorceries, and forget about it. The secret is directional. Ambush. Shard fires from behind the target. Whatever you lock onto or aim at, the bolt spawns on the opposite side of the enemy from you and travels inward. This has a staggering implication for shielded opponents. In PvP, enemies blocking with a shield towards you are fully exposed on the back of that shield. Ambush Shard fires into their unguarded side and deals damage without the block reduction. Against shielded NPC invaders who plant themselves defensively, it is an almost unfair tool. It also bypasses certain enemy cover behaviors in PvE, punishing enemies who have tucked behind environmental geometry. The Primal Glintstone Blade Gamble. At Stargazer's ruins in the mountaintops of the Giants, near a jellyfish searching for her sister, there is a hidden staircase beneath the ruins that requires summoning a spirit jellyfish next to the grieving spectral jellyfish to unlock. Inside the cellar sits the Primal Glintstone Blade Talisman. Equipping it reduces the FP cost of all your spells by 25%, a reduction large enough to substantially extend your spell count per rest, allowing you to cast through long boss fights without the constant pressure of watching your blue bar drain. The cost is a reduction of 15% of your maximum HP. which at 60 Vigor drops you from roughly 1,900 HP down to around 1,615, equivalent to about 10 lost levels of Vigor. For a ranged mage who keeps distance and rarely takes hits, this trade can work in your favor. You gain more spellcast than you sacrifice in theoretical survivability, especially if you are burning through cerulean flasks constantly. The psychological texture of a boss fight changes when FP management stops feeling like a crisis, though it does demand honest self-assessment about how often you actually get hit. The Magic Scorpions trade Preceptor Seluvis, the imperious, scheming sorcerer who lives in his tower near Rani's Rise, will, if you follow his quest line to a specific point, reward you with the Magic Scorpion Charm Talisman. The charm increases all magic damage dealt by 12%. This is a significant number, multiplicatively stacking with your other damage boosts. The cost is that physical damage taken increases by 10%. For a ranged caster who rarely lets enemies close enough to hit them, this penalty is often inconsequential. But for a Carian melee sorcerer who regularly closes into sword range with Carian Slicer, the incoming damage tax is real and demands a playstyle adjustment. The charm is worth acquiring regardless of which build you run, if only to have the option to equip it for range boss encounters where you maintain strong positioning and distance control. It is a conditional 12% damage bonus, and even conditional advantages compound into meaningful results. Night Maiden's Mist and the Patient Boss. The Night Maiden's Mist is the strangest sorcery in the Night family. It releases a drifting silver cloud that deals continuous damage to both enemies and the caster standing inside it. Most players test it briefly, dislike the self-damage element, and move on. The actual use case is positioning, not standing inside the mist yourself. Night Maiden's Mist is a slow, continuous AoE that covers a floor area and deals tick damage every moment an enemy remains within it, against enemies with fixed patrol routes, specifically large, slow bosses who walk back and forth across a defined arena zone. You cast the mist into the space they will walk through and wait. Bosses that would dodge a direct projectile will simply lumber through the fog, unaware that they are being damaged. The Godskin duo fight in Farum Azula, notorious for its aggressive paired boss format, can be significantly defanged by casting the mist into the center of the arena, where both bosses naturally migrate during their patrol phase. Glintstone Icecrag and the cheap Frost Loop, Frostbite builds in Elden Ring, tend to use physical weapons, bleed frost infusions, freeze on hit Ashes of War. But there is a sorcery that handles the entire Frostbite application process at a remarkably low intelligence requirement and FP cost. Glintstone Icecrag is sold by Preceptor Seluvis for 7,500 runes and requires 20 intelligence. It fires a compact frost projectile that inflicts 100 frostbite build-up per hit, a significant amount that builds the status quickly on most non-immune enemies. As a standalone damage spell, it is outclassed by most other options at its level, but as the opening move in a Rani's Dark Moon combo, where you use the cheaper, faster Icecrag to proc Frostbite for the increased damage vulnerability, then follow immediately with high damage magic sorceries during the debuff window. It transforms into a damage multiplying setup tool that earns far more than its modest profile suggests. You can proc Frostbite quickly, recast as needed, and maintain a vulnerability cycle through long boss fights. Founding Reign of Stars and the Invisible Bridge. In the mountaintops of the Giants, east of Castle Sol and near a minor Erd tree, there is a tower called Heretical Rise. The tower appears on the map, but reaching it is not straightforward. because the bridge connecting to it is completely invisible. You cannot see it, and there is no in-game marker that explains this clearly. The path begins on the opposite side of the ravine, at the ruined end of a bridge that appears to stop in mid-air. The invisible continuation extends across the gap, and the safest way to navigate it is to place rainbow stones along the path as you inch forward, or playing at night when subtle mist-like visual cues are slightly more visible, follow the barely perceptible horizon of the hidden stone. Inside the chest at the top of Heretical Rise is Founding Rain of Stars, one of the 6 legendary sorceries. A spell that calls down a cascading torrent of star projectiles from a dark cloud overhead, dealing sweeping area damage to everything below. It is the eldest primeval sorcery, the origin point of the entire glintstone tradition, found across an invisible bridge most players never cross. The Eternal Darkness projectile vacuum. Eternal Darkness is a sorcery that almost never comes up in discussions of effective sorcery builds, and the reason is that it deals 0 damage. What it does is summon a dark orb that drifts forward and absorbs enemy projectile sorceries on contact, catching spells out of the air before they reach you. This niche sounds theoretical until you reach the endgame. In the fight against the Elden beast, one of its most punishing attacks is Elden stars, a slow but relentlessly tracking cascade of holy projectiles that carpets a wide area and is genuinely difficult to evade without torrent. Some players report that Eternal Darkness, cast into the path of Elden stars, can absorb portions of the cascade, though based on what players have observed in practice, its reliability against boss-specific spells appears to vary. It seems most consistent against tracking and homing projectiles, and less so against spells specifically flagged as boss-tier attacks. The spell requires 35 intelligence and is found on a corpse inside a jail cell in the Swamp Lookout Tower in Caelid, reached by heading south from Celia Town of Sorcery across the Celia Gateway, then following the road north to a tower perched on the cliff top above the swamp. The Meteorite Staff Discovery Route. New players attempting a sorcery build almost always have the same experience. They start with the Astrologer class, struggle with their low damage starting spells in early Limgrave, and spend the first several hours casting things that feel satisfying, but don't hit hard enough. The Meteorite Staff, sitting in a location most new players wouldn't organically reach until mid-game, can be collected almost immediately if you know where to look. From the dragon-burnt ruins in Limgrave, there is a chest that teleports you directly to Caelid's Celia Crystal Tunnel. An unpleasant surprise. But if you escape that tunnel via the entrance, rather than dying inside, you are standing in central Caelid with access to the surrounding area. The Meteorite Staff is south of Celia, town of sorcery near the swamp of Aeonia. Rock Sling, its perfect companion, is just north of the Street of Sages ruins. 2 items, both obtainable in the first hour with determination, that together form one of the strongest early game sorcery setups in the game. The Meteorite Staff will outperform upgraded alternatives until you have 60 or more intelligence. The Graven Mass Talisman and where to actually get it. The Graven Mass Talisman is the premier damage-boosting talisman for any sorcery build, raising the potency of all sorceries by 8%. 8% sounds modest until you remember that it is multiplicative. It compounds on top of every other percentage modifier you have already applied, and a 12-stack build where everything multiplies against everything else can see the Graven Mass contribution result in significantly more than its listed number suggests in effective output. The talisman is found in a chest at the top of Albinoric Rise, a tower in the eastern portion of the consecrated snowfield, a late-game area requiring both halves of the Haligtree medallion to access. The tower itself is sealed by a puzzle that requires either Fenged Imp ashes summoned inside or a bewitching branch used on the imps patrolling outside to make them fight each other and break the seal. It is worth every step of that journey. The Radagon icon location and its limits. The Radagon icon is a legendary talisman, one of the rarest category of items in Elden Ring, and it lives in a chest tucked away in Raya Lucaria Academy. Reachable without defeating any boss if you know the rooftop route. From the debate parlor site of Grace, head north into the courtyard, hug the building wall to your right, jump over the fence, climb the ladder, and a chest on the balcony beyond holds it. The icon grants 30 virtual dexterity toward cast speed only, with no effect on weapon damage or any other stat. This matters at lower dexterity levels. Below 40 dex, the speed up is very noticeable. Above 40 dex, it still helps, but the gains diminish, since casting speed follows a curve rather than a straight line. At 40 dex combined with the Radagon icon, you reach the 70 dex casting speed cap completely, meaning there is never a reason to invest dexterity beyond that threshold purely for cast speed purposes on a dedicated sorcery build. The Cerulean Hidden Tear and Free sorceries. Every flask of Wondrous Physic can hold 2 crystal tears, and for sorcery builds, one combination rises above all others as the most impactful. The Cerulean Hidden Tear, found by defeating the ulcerated tree spirit at the minor Erd tree on Mount Gelmir. Accessible via the Road of Iniquity site of Grace east of Volcano Manor. Eliminates all FP consumption for approximately 10 seconds after drinking. 10 seconds of free spells. For most sorceries, this means 4 to 8 free casts. For Comet Azure, it means 10 seconds of uninterrupted beam damage with no drain on your FP bar whatsoever, paired with the magic shrouding crack tear in the second slot, which simultaneously applies a 20% magic damage boost. You have one drink that triggers the most devastating possible window of sorcery output in the entire game. The window is brief. The results can be permanent for the boss experiencing it. The Oracle Bubble Ambush technique. Great Oracular Bubble is found via a teardrop scarab in the Worshipper's Woods near the Siofra River, and it is one of the stranger sorceries in Elden Ring. A large, slow-moving bubble that inflicts significant damage but travels at a pace that seems almost counterintuitively slow for an offensive spell. Against a direct enemy who dodges or moves laterally, it frequently misses. The correct use involves patience and positioning. Cast 1 to 3 bubbles before entering the aggro radius of a large, slow enemy, particularly in open areas where you can see them from a distance before triggering their awareness. The bubbles drift toward them at their own pace, and the enemy's AI engages its dodge response based on the threat being registered. Against targets that do not dodge, all 3 bubbles connect before the fight has technically begun. One of the most satisfying ways to deal with a grafted scion or a field boss is to load several oracular bubbles into their patrol space from outside their sightline and watch them walk into them. The Carian Regal Scepter and Spinning Weapon. The Carian Regal Scepter is obtained by defeating Renala and exchanging her remembrance with Enya at the Round Table Hold. It requires 60 intelligence to wield, which is its appropriate place in the build journey. A mid to late game upgrade that rewards committing to the intelligence stat long enough to reach that threshold. Beyond its solid sorcery scaling, 373 at maximum upgrade with 80 intelligence. The Carian Regal Scepter carries an unusual unique Ash of War called Spinning Weapon, which activates a whirling melee staff attack that deals massive magic damage in rapid succession. This turns your Sorcery Catalyst into a close-range melee tool with genuinely terrifying DPS output, and it notably triggers the Rotten Wing Sword, Insignia Talisman, stacking attack power per successive hit, even though you are casting a sorcery, not making a weapon attack. Intelligence builds that carry the Carian Regal Scepter are not purely ranged casters. They have a surprise option that reshapes close encounters entirely. Prince of Death's Staff, the hybrid catalyst. The Prince of Death's Staff is the most underused staff in Elden Ring among pure intelligence players, and the reason is simple. It requires both intelligence and faith to achieve its peak scaling. A player who went deep into one stat tends not to look twice at a catalyst that demands investment in both. But for players willing to split their stat budget across the two attributes, the Prince of Death's Staff provides A-tier scaling in both simultaneously, and it unlocks a specific school of sorceries called Death Sorceries that pure INT builds can't cast at all. Ancient Death Rancor summons a barrage of skull projectiles that home in on targets with persistence. Explosive Ghost Flame combines cold fire and explosive damage into a hybrid burst that hits everything in a wide arc. Death Sorceries scale harder in the late game as flat enemy defenses matter less, and the Prince of Death's Staff, carried with Golden Order Seal in the offhand, creates one of the most genuinely unusual builds in the game. A Death Sorcerer who channels both the Grave and the Grace simultaneously. The Magma Shot Splash, Faith Sorcery. Hybrid. Magma Shot is one of those spells that gets quietly carried around by players who almost never use it because they cannot figure out when it fits. It requires 19 intelligence and only 10 faith, an almost trivially low faith requirement, and fires a lump of molten magma that explodes on contact and leaves a persistent pool of lava. The pool itself deals fire damage over time to anything standing in it, which means Magma Shot is one of the few sorceries in the game that has a passive area denial component beyond its initial hit. Against slow bosses that linger in a fixed area, the lava pool continues punishing them after the spell is already over. The Gelmir Glintstone Staff boosts Magma Shot and all magma sorceries by a specific percentage, and can be found in Elphael, Brace of the Halig Tree. It drops from Crystal Mage enemies near the Elphael Inner Wall site of Grace. The staff is not a top-tier casting implement on raw scaling, but as a passive buff for a Magma Specialist loadout, it earns its slot. Night Shard, the Invisible Pebble. While Night Comet gets most of the attention among night sorceries, Night Shard is a smaller, faster version that fills a different role and deserves equal respect. It costs exactly the same FP as Glintstone Pebble, has a similar cast speed, and deals comparable or slightly less direct damage. The difference that matters is the same one that makes Night Comet dominant. Enemies cannot register the projectile as a threat and will not attempt to dodge it. For enemies that sidestep every Glintstone Pebble you cast, Night Shard is a direct upgrade that maintains the same FP economy. Gowry, the mysterious sorcerer sitting in a shack south of Celia in Caelid, sells Night Shard after you progress through Millicent's questline to the point where he becomes a merchant. It requires only 18 intelligence, slotting neatly into early to mid-game builds that are not yet running Night Comet's higher requirement. Carian Phalanx and the Floating Shield. Most players learn about Carian Phalanx because it orbits your character and automatically fires swords at anything that approaches you, which sounds useful and is useful, but the spell's greatest strength is less obvious. It costs 26 FP, requires 34 intelligence, and can be cast before entering a room, before opening a fog gate, before any moment where you know something is about to aggress on you. In a dungeon boss encounter, casting Carian Phalanx on the approach means that the moment the boss appears and walks into range, floating swords immediately fire and apply their damage, possibly triggering a flinch or stagger window before you have taken a single deliberate action. It is a preemptive opening strike with no cast time cost in the actual engagement. Combined with Great Blade Phalanx, which fires larger overhead blades that deal exceptional poise damage, a passive phalanx setup can contribute meaningfully to stance breaks without consuming combat cast windows. Magic Glintblade's perfect delay. The Magic Glintblade is the prisoner class starting spell and one of the most tactically interesting sorceries in the game for a reason that takes a moment to notice. Unlike direct projectile sorceries that travel immediately upon cast, Magic Glintblade creates a floating blade that orbits you briefly and then fires after a short delay. During that delay, the blade tracks movement. If the enemy dodges the instant you cast, the blade adjusts its aim during the brief targeting window. If the enemy dodges just before the blade fires, it adjusts again. Melania, Blade of Miquella, who dodges virtually every direct projectile sorcery in the game with an almost supernatural ability to read incoming attacks, cannot effectively dodge Magic Glintblade. The delay and tracking combined make it one of the only reliable direct damage sorceries against her, for a fight that frustrates sorcerers who rely on beam or projectile spam. This 3,000 run purchase from Muriel, Pastor of Vows, changes the dynamic entirely. The Albinauric Staff's arcane secret. Almost everything in Elden Ring's sorcery system scales with intelligence. The Albinauric Staff does not. It scales primarily with arcane, with secondary scaling in intelligence, and reaches S-tier arcane scaling from upgrade level, plus 19 onward. This creates an entire secondary spellcasting identity for characters who invest in arcane, typically associated with bleed builds, dragon communion, or status effect applications rather than classical sorcery. Any sorcery the game categorizes as a normal intelligence spell can be cast from the Albinauric Staff, and on a high arcane character, the damage output is surprisingly competitive. The most interesting application is a bleed magic hybrid, a character running blood-infused weapons, arcane scaling incantations for dragon breath and status stacking, and intelligence sorceries cast from the Albinauric Staff for ranged pressure. It is unusual, but it operates effectively and gives the build a ranged option without requiring a separate intelligence investment. The Gelmir Glintstone Staff and Magma sorceries. There is a small, curated subset of sorceries in Elden Ring that deal fire damage rather than magic damage. The Magma spells, each drawing from the volcanic heritage of Mount Gelmir and the Volcano Manor legacy. Magma Shot, Roiling Magma, Gelmir's Fury, and Rykard's Rancor all fall into this category, and they share a unique property. They benefit from physical buffs like Flame, grant me strength rather than from Magic Scorpion Charm or Terra Magica. The Gelmir Glintstone Staff specifically boosts all of these magma sorceries by a passive percentage, similar to how specialty staves work for other schools. It drops from crystal mages near the Elphael Inner Wall site of Grace inside Miquella's Haligtree, a late-game area. But the payoff for a dedicated magma sorcerer who builds around it is access to a fire damage sorcery school that bypasses the magic resistance that causes intelligence, builds to struggle against certain enemies. Carrion Retaliation. The Sorcery Parry. Most discussions of parrying in Elden Ring focus on the physical mechanics. Timing a deflect with a shield or small weapon to knock a melee attack aside and open a critical window. Carrion Retaliation does something different. Equipped in the offhand, it replaces the standard parry animation with a magical deflection that catches incoming sorcery projectiles. When you successfully retaliate against an enemy sorcery, a cluster of glint blades appears and retaliates automatically, firing into the attacker. It works on ranged incantations too, not just pure sorcery projectiles. In PvP, it reshapes the dynamic of a mage versus mage encounter entirely. A caster who positions correctly and times deflections effectively can catch their opponent's spell and fire back simultaneously. In PvE, certain sorcerer-type enemies in Raya Lucaria and in the Renala fight's first phase can have their own spells caught and returned. It is the most active defensive sorcery in the game and rewards a different style of engagement from any other spell. The Loretta Jewel Drop. Most players encounter Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, twice throughout a full Elden Ring playthrough. Once as a mandatory boss in the Caria Manor Legacy Dungeon in Leonia, and again as an optional, significantly harder, version at the Haligtree itself in the consecrated snowfield. Both versions drop sorceries, and they are not the same spell. The Caria Manor Loretta drops Loretta's Great Bow, a sorcery that fires a single massive magical arrow with extraordinary range and significant damage. Excellent for sniping from positions the enemy cannot easily reach. The Haligtree Loretta drops Loretta's Mastery, the upgraded version that fires 4 giant arrows simultaneously in a widespread pattern. A single fully charged Loretta's Mastery cast against a large boss can land all 4 arrows for combined damage that rivals the legendary sorceries in Raw Burst. The key to landing all 4 is targeting massive enemies from a distance where the spread pattern converges rather than fans too wide to hit. Gravity Well in Miquella's Haligtree. Miquella's Haligtree is considered by many players to be the hardest optional area in the base game. Narrow branches, aggressive enemies with no mercy, and drops that erase minutes of progress. Many of the enemies patrolling the outer tree branches and interior walkways can be pulled to their deaths by Gravity Well before combat even begins. The sorcery fires a compressed gravity orb that detonates on contact and yanks the target toward your position with considerable force. In a location built entirely on precarious elevated surfaces, the ability to pull an armored knight or a Haligtree soldier off a branch from 30 meters away transforms a dangerous encounter into an uncontested gravity kill. Gravity Well is purchased from Muriel, Pastor of Vows for 6,000 runes, requires 46 intelligence, and deals 100% magic damage that benefits from Magic Scorpion Charm and Terra Magica's boosts. It is a dungeon clearing tool masquerading as a combat spell. Impenetrable Thorns, the Faith Sorcery, Shadow of the Erd Tree, Elden Ring's expansion into the Land of Shadow, introduced a sorcery that broke a fundamental expectation players had about how the spell school works. Impenetrable Thorns is classified as a sorcery. It requires faith to cast, not intelligence. 23 faith, 0 intelligence. And it deals bleed buildup, not magic damage. It is effectively an incantation that occupies a sorcery spell slot, and when cast from an arcane scaling staff like the Albinoric staff or the DLC's maternal staff, it inflicts bleed build-up rapidly and cheaply at only 15 FP per cast. Players who discovered it in the DLC and understood how to scale it correctly found it was capable of stacking bleed faster than any traditional bleed weapon at equivalent investment levels for a character who wants a sorcery staff build that nevertheless revolves around bleed. As the primary damage source, Impenetrable Thorns, found within the Shadowkeep Legacy dungeon, represents a genuinely new archetype that didn't exist in the base game. The Godfrey icon and charged spell damage. Every sorcery in Elden Ring can be held and charged before releasing. Charged versions deal more damage. How much more depends on the spell, but most scale meaningfully. The Godfrey icon talisman, obtained from defeating Godfroy the Grafted in the Golden Lineage Evergull in Altus Plateau, just south of the Grand Lift of Dectus, requiring a stone sword key to access, boosts the damage of all charged spells by exactly 15%. For spells that already reward charging, Glintstone Comet Shard, Glintstone Ice Crag, Comet, Collapsing Stars, Gravity Well. This is a consistent, reliable uplift that applies every time you take the extra moment to charge rather than quick fire. The talisman pairs exceptionally well with ranged, deliberate gameplay, where you have the patience to charge each spell during boss openings rather than spam. If you are a careful caster who holds fire until a boss commits to an animation and finishes vulnerable, Godfrey Icon turns those disciplined moments into noticeably heavier hits. Rykard's Rancor, the Serpent God's spell. After defeating Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, at the bottom of Volcano Manor, a fight made significantly more approachable by the Serpent Hunter Great Spear found in the boss room. You can exchange his remembrance with Inia for one of two options. One is a weapon, the other is Rykard's Rancor, Rykard's own sorcery which he used during the fight, calling down serpentine fire from above that tracks slowly and relentlessly before detonating. It requires 40 intelligence and 10 faith, deals fire damage like all magma sorceries, and benefits from the Gelmir Glintstone Staff's passive boost. The spell is one of the more visually spectacular options available to the fire sorcery hybrid, and its tracking is persistent enough that fast-moving enemies who dodge away from the initial cast often get caught on the follow-up arc. It is only obtainable once per playthrough from the Remembrance, and it lingers as one of the more thematically fitting rewards in a game full of lore-appropriate drops. Crystal Barrage and Crystallian sorceries. The Crystallian enemies found throughout the game, particularly in the Academy Glintstone Cave and later in Elfale, drop a small family of sorceries built around crystal shards. Crystal Barrage fires a rapid burst of tiny crystal fragments in a spreading cone. Crystal Burst launches a single large crystal ball, and Crystal Torrent fires a sustained cone-shaped beam of crystal shards. None of these spells are particularly powerful in isolation, but the Crystal Staff, found behind an illusory wall inside the Academy Crystal Cave, requiring 48 intelligence, boosts Crystallian sorceries by 10%. The niche here is finding the overlap between what the school does well and what a 10% amplified version of it can accomplish. Crystal Torrent, boosted by the Crystal Staff and cast, while an enemy is frostbitten or otherwise debuffed, contributes sustained DPS in situations where charging into Comet Azur range is not viable. It is a genuinely underexplored branch of the sorcery tree. The Death Sorcery School, Prince of Death Staff, opens the door to a class of spells so unusual that most players never equip the catalyst to even see them. Death sorceries are sorceries that require both intelligence and faith, typically around 30 to 42 of each at their upper end, and they deal a hybrid damage type that resists many of the immunities that make standard sorceries situationally weak. Rancorcal fires a wave of skull projectiles that home in on targets at modest FP cost. Ancient Death Rancor fires a larger, denser barrage with more aggressive tracking. Explosive Ghost Flame combines a burst of cold fire damage with an explosion that hits a wide area. Fear's Mist, obtained by completing Fear's questline to its conclusion in Deeproot Depths, applies a Death Blight cloud that builds an unusual status effect. The school rewards players who want something genuinely different from standard sorcery, and it operates completely outside the normal INT scaling paradigm. You are building for 2 stats simultaneously and receiving a school of spells that no other build configuration can access. Scholar's Armament, the hybrid tool. Most sorcery builds eventually face the same problem. FP runs low during a boss. The blue bar empties, and you are left with your staff and nothing useful to do in melee range. Scholar's Armament is a sorcery that enchants your right-hand weapon with magic damage for a duration, turning a plain weapon into a magic-scaling threat that costs no FP to swing. For intelligence builds that keep a keen-infused or magic-infused melee weapon as a secondary option, Scholar's Armament effectively doubles the damage of that weapon during its enchantment window. It stacks with your intelligence scaling, stacks with Magic Scorpion Charm, and stacks with Terra Magica. In FP dry situations, particularly during the phase where you wait for a Cerulean Flask opportunity, swapping to a buffed melee weapon maintains your damage contribution instead of leaving you either ineffective at range or exposed in melee with an unbuffed normal weapon. Great Blade Phalanx and stance damage. The standard Carian Phalanx orbits you and fires small glint blades reactively. Great Blade Phalanx calls down larger, overhead phantom blades that drop onto enemies in the area in front of you. The critical difference beyond size is what these larger blades do to enemy stance. Stance damage, the stat that governs when an enemy gets staggered and exposed to a critical hit, is tracked separately from HP damage, and most sorceries deal low stance damage because they prioritize consistent HP reduction. Great Blade Phalanx deals exceptional stance damage per blade that lands. Against bosses where stance breaking is a viable strategy, casting Great Blade Phalanx aggressively during attack windows contributes meaningfully to the stagger count alongside whatever weapon pressure you or your summons are applying. You can purchase it from Miriel at the Church of Vows for 10,000 runes after giving him the appropriate scroll. The Cannon of Heimer Wall exploit. Cannon of Heimer is one of the more unusual offensive sorceries in Elden Ring. It fires a large magic cannonball at significant FP cost that deals heavy damage on impact, with considerable AoE around the strike point. The radius of the explosion is larger than it appears, and many players discover accidentally that it can hit enemies through thin walls and around environmental corners. The AoE bleeds slightly through geometry, meaning that an enemy sheltering behind a pillar or wall corner can take damage from a Cannon of Heimer detonating on the near side of that cover. In Raya Lucaria and certain dungeon structures, casters who realize this can clear rooms significantly faster than direct engagement suggests. The spell is acquired from the converted Fringe Tower after completing a gesture puzzle that requires performing specific actions at the tower's lock mechanism, one of the stranger content locking systems in a game full of unusual puzzles. Frozen Armament and Hybrid Melee. Frozen Armament is a sorcery that enchants your right-hand weapon with frost damage for a duration, similar to Scholar's Armament, but building frostbite instead of adding magic damage. It requires only 15 intelligence and is sold by Preceptor Siluvis, making it accessible very early for any intelligence-adjacent build. For a character who wants to cycle Frostbite onto enemies without spending a spell slot on a dedicated build-up spell, or without running a frost-infused weapon. Frozen armament on a fast physical weapon allows the melee attacks themselves to accumulate frost status over a few hits. When Frostbite procs, the damage burst and vulnerability window open, and you can follow with your highest damage sorcery during the debuff. It is a hybrid cycle that uses the weapon as the setup tool and the spells as the payoff damage, the inverse of how most hybrid builds operate. The Starlight Sorcery. Starlight is possibly the most overlooked sorcery in the entire game. It is a utility spell purchased from Selen for 1,500 runes that does nothing in combat. It creates a small hovering orb of light that illuminates the area around you, functioning as a magical torch. In a world where so many dungeons and underground areas are genuinely very dark, particularly on first exploration runs where the player has not memorized every layout, Starlight is a quality of life tool that some players never discover exists. Carrying it and not having to fumble with a torch while also managing spells, freeing your offhand for a second staff, is a small but real comfort in the more claustrophobic sections of the game. It is the kind of sorcery that doesn't appear in any build guide and doesn't contribute to any optimization. It just makes the dark a little less frightening when you are walking through an eternal city at midnight and would rather not trip over a sleeping gargoyle. The Celia Town Puzzles. Celia, Town of Sorcery in Caelid, is one of the most atmospheric locations in the game. A beautiful, decrepit tower town, half drowned in scarlet rot, haunted by phantom sorcerers who drift through its alleys without acknowledging your presence. But the town is also sealed. 3 fire braziers are positioned atop towers visible from the streets, and lighting each one progressively unseals the magical barriers blocking treasure throughout the town. Most players who arrive in Celia without guidance manage to light 1 or 2 braziers before missing the third and leaving frustrated. The complete set of rewards requires lighting all 3. And among the treasures unlocked by completing the puzzle are Night Comet in a sealed chest at the town centre, as well as access to a path leading deeper into Celia's northeastern section. The town rewards thorough exploration and the patience to find all 3 towers, making it one of the more satisfying optional puzzle areas in the game for sorcery-focused players specifically. Miriam's Vanishing and the Dodge Cast. Shadow of the Erdtree introduced Miriam's Vanishing, a sorcery unlike anything in the base game. It is a dodge roll performed as a spell. Your character vanishes mid-movement, repositions, and breaks enemy target locks simultaneously. It is effectively an evasion sorcery. Using a spell slot to execute a high-quality dodge, with the added benefit of briefly dropping from enemy awareness. For ranged casters who struggle when an aggressive boss closes distance and forces them to dodge away, but then must recast into the boss's follow-up, Miriam's Vanishing solves the problem by making the reposition itself a spell that resets the engagement. You dodge and you cast simultaneously, gaining position while breaking lock. The spell comes from Preceptor Miriam in an inverted tower sequence in the DLC, and it works well with any build that treats spacing as a primary combat resource, rather than a reactive panic mechanic. The Blessing Blue Dew and passive FP recovery. One of the most quietly impactful items added in Shadow of the Erdtree is the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, a charm that provides passive FP regeneration over time, slowly refilling your blue bar without any action required. For sorcery builds, which burn through FP faster than any other build archetype and rely on cerulean flasks to sustain combat, the Blessed Blue Dew changes the open world experience fundamentally. Between dungeon encounters, while riding across the lands between or navigating connected areas, your FP trickles back without touching your flask supply. You arrive at the next site of grace or the next boss fog gate with more blue in reserve. In extended dungeon sequences where flasks are precious and resting is infrequent, the passive regeneration compounds into a meaningful advantage that does not show up on any damage output chart, but is felt constantly during actual play. Stars of Ruins tracking against fast bosses. The defining problem for sorcery builds against fast-moving bosses is that they sidestep. They read incoming projectiles, shift lateral position, and watch your comet sail past while they are already mid-animation into their next attack. Stars of Ruin removes this problem category entirely for any boss it affects. The 12 projectiles it releases do not fire in a fixed forward direction. They arc and curve individually, each one computing an independent path toward the nearest enemy. A boss that dashes sideways will be followed by stars that adjust their trajectories mid-flight. A boss that jumps will have stars that curve upward to intercept. The only effective counter is having no enemy in range at all, which means Stars of Ruin is most effective at medium range, where the tracking trajectories can smoothly converge. At very close range, the arcs can curve past the target. At very long range, projectile variance allows some to miss. The mid-range sweet spot against an aggressive boss that fights from close to medium distance is where Stars of Ruin performs its best work. The Selen quest and spell access. Sorceress Selen is one of the more complicated NPC quest lines in Elden Ring, requiring encounters across 3 separate locations and a pivotal choice near the end. She's the primary spell vendor for early and mid-game sorceries. Glintstone Pebble, Glintstone Arc, Carrion Slicer, and many others come from her initially. But progressing her questline further and choosing to side with her over Jeren at its climax unlocks the purchase of Shard Spiral for 8,000 runes. Shard Spiral cannot be purchased from anyone else, and siding with Jeren instead permanently locks it out of that playthrough. Selen's quest takes her from Waypoint Ruins in Limgrave to a hidden location inside Witchbane Ruins in the Weeping Peninsula, where her true body is imprisoned, and then finally to a confrontation at Raya Lucaria itself. Players who fully commit to her arc and make the correct choice gain access to what the Steam community widely recognizes as the most underrated sustained damage sorcery in the game. The choice has weight, and it is worth knowing before you make it. The Godskin Duo and the Mist strategy. The Godskin Duo fight in Farum Azula traps players in a circular arena with 2 very aggressive enemies, a Godskin Noble and a Godskin Apostle, who take turns being unconscious and respawning, requiring players to deplete a shared HP pool that ticks down rather than being tied to individual kill counts. For melee builds, the fight is chaotic and punishing. For sorcery builds who carry Night Maiden's Mist, it is substantially different. The Mist, cast into the center of the arena where both enemies naturally migrate as they cycle through attack and recovery phases, deals continuous damage to any enemy walking through it. The Apostle and Noble are both slow enough to spend meaningful time in the cloud, and because the Mist does not register as a traditional projectile threat, neither enemy performs a dedicated dodge response. You are dealing passive damage that neither opponent is scripted to acknowledge. Combined with a spirit summon holding aggro, the fight transforms into something much more manageable. The Glintblade Trio combo potential. The Glintblade Trio, introduced in Shadow of the Erdtree, fires 3 delayed tracking glint blades simultaneously, rather than the single blade of the standard magic glint blade. The delay before the blade's fire is similar to the original, but having 3 converge on a target at once means that even a partial dodge still tends to connect 1 or 2 of them. The spell is available from Countermere at the Cathedral of Manus Meteor in the DLC's Skadu Altus region, and it pairs beautifully with Carrion Phalanx as a setup. Sequence. Cast Carrion Phalanx to put floating swords around you. Immediately follow with Glintblade Trio, and the delayed fire triple blades land alongside the Phalanx's reactive fire from multiple angles simultaneously. Against a boss that is occupied with dodging the Phalanx retaliation, the trio connects on the recovery frames. It is an imprecise science, but a visually remarkable one, and the accumulated damage from both spells firing in overlapping windows is higher than either alone by a meaningful margin. The Relana Twin Moon Spectacle. Every sorcery in Elden Ring is functional, but Relana's Twin Moons from Shadow of the Erdtree is the one that made players stop mid-boss fight to appreciate what was happening on screen. The spell conjures 2 enormous glowing moons that orbit briefly before being slammed simultaneously into the ground in a wide detonation area. The visual scope, 2 lunar bodies descending together, the ground erupting in light, is unlike anything else in the game's spell repertoire. It is obtained by exchanging Relana's remembrance after defeating Relana, Twin Moon Knight, one of the DLC's early mandatory bosses. Its casting time is long, making it difficult to use safely against fast enemies, and it is best reserved for slow opponents or clear openings where you have a guaranteed window. But when it lands, it deals some of the highest burst magic damage of any sorcery in the entire game. And the Carrion Regal Scepter's 10% boost to full moon sorceries applies, giving it one more reason to be the centerpiece of a specific late-game spellcaster identity. The Azur Crown and what it actually costs. Primeval sorcerer Azur sits motionless on the slopes of Mount Gelmir, his body preserved in whatever state the primeval current left him. And after you claim Comet Azur from him, something else becomes available. If you return to his location after completing Sorceress Selen's questline, you can collect the Azure Glintstone set, including Azur's Glintstone Crown. The crown provides a specific passive boost. Comet Azur deals 15% more damage. The standard Comet spell deals 10% more, and Glintstone Comet Shard deals 10% more. That is a meaningful uplift for a build built around those 3 spells specifically. But the trade-off is that all sorceries cost 15% more FP while wearing it, not just the ones it boosts. If Comet Azur is your centerpiece spell, and you are already using the Cerulean Hidden Tier to negate FP cost during the channel window, the FP tax becomes largely irrelevant for that specific cast. Outside of that window, you are bleeding blue faster on every other spell in your kit. The crown is a precision tool, exceptional in the exact setup it was designed for, costly everywhere else. Lusar's Crown and the Stars Multiplier. The companion piece to Azur's Crown belongs to Master Lusar, and it follows the same logic on the opposite side of the primeval divide. Lusar's Glintstone Crown boosts Stars of Ruin by 15% and the other Comet-type sorceries by 10%, while increasing FP cost across all sorceries by 15%. Because Stars of Ruin is already one of the highest damage spells available when all 12 projectiles connect, a 15% amplification pushes it into territory that genuinely threatens boss health bars with a single well-placed cast. You can find Lusar's set, including the crown, at Celia Hideaway in Caelid, resting where Lusar's body once was, but only after completing the Selen questline and choosing to side with her at the conclusion. Lusa's body disappears once you resolve her questline regardless of which choice you make, leaving his robes and crown as the lasting remnant of a sorcerer who glimpsed the primeval current and was permanently undone by it. The crown is an acknowledgement of that cost, worn by those who choose power over caution. The Cerulean Seed Talisman. Every caster running a dedicated intelligence build eventually runs into the same calculation problem. How many cerulean flasks do you carry versus how many crimson ones? And is the answer ever comfortable? The Cerulean Seed Talisman, found in the rafters of the Carian Study Hall in eastern Leonia. Accessible by climbing the ladders to the uppermost beam level of the tower. Boosts the amount of FP recovered by each cerulean flask used by 20%. It does not give you more flasks. It does not passively regenerate FP the way the Blessed Blue Dew does. What it does is make each individual drink hit the blue bar harder, so that a smaller number of cerulean flasks restores what a larger number would have without it. For builds that were previously allocating 4 or 5 flasks to blue, this talisman allows a 1 flask reduction in that count, freeing a slot for a red flask without reducing your total FP recovery through a boss fight. Small adjustments to flask allocation across a long fight make a larger difference than they appear on paper, and the Cerulean Seed is one of the quieter quality of life talismans that experienced casters learn to value far more than newer players expect. The Ritual Sword Talisman and the Full HP Mage. The Ritual Sword Talisman increases attack power by a flat percentage when your HP is at its maximum. For a melee fighter who takes constant chip damage in close quarters, this is difficult to maintain. For a ranged sorcerer who positions at distance, keeps their health topped through careful play, and only takes damage when they misread a boss attack, the condition is naturally met during most of a fight's opening and middle phases. The payoff is consistent extra damage on every spell you cast while untouched. It does not require you to be doing anything specific beyond not getting hit, which, for a build philosophy that already emphasizes spacing and positioning, is not an additional burden, so much as a reward for doing the thing the build already wants to do. The Ritual Sword Talisman is obtained from a chest at Lux Ruins in Altus Plateau, and it occupies a talisman slot that feels entirely free when your playstyle naturally keeps you out of trouble. The Renala Fight and the Full Moon Counter. Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, is one of Elden Ring's most visually extraordinary boss fights, and her second phase involves her casting sorceries at you, projectile-based attacks that travel across the arena with a deliberate, almost stately pace. What most players overlook is that Renala's Full Moon, the sorcery you can obtain from her remembrance, has a passive property it shares with Ranni's Dark Moon. Both full moon sorceries dispel other sorcery projectiles they contact as they travel. When you cast either full moon directly into an incoming hostile sorcery during the Renala fight, or against any sorcerer-type enemy in the game, the moon absorbs the opposing spell entirely, clearing the path it was traveling along. This is an almost never discussed defensive application of the full moon sorceries, and it works in a fight against the very boss who originally wielded one of them. You fight a sorcerer queen using her own family's signature spell to absorb her attacks. The Gavel of Heimer Puzzle. One of the strangest content locking mechanisms in all of Elden Ring protects the Gavel of Heimer sorcery at the converted Fringe Tower in Leonia. The tower is sealed not by a key, not by an imp statue requiring stone sword keys, but by a riddle written on a stone plaque at its base. The plaque instructs you to perform the erudition gesture while wearing a glintstone crown near the statue. The erudition gesture is obtained by giving Sorcerer Thops a spare glintstone key as part of his questline. Any glintstone crown from the glintstone family satisfies the requirement, including the Carolo's glintstone crown found on a giant lobster near the debate parlor inside Raya Lucaria. Perform erudition, wearing the crown, the seal breaks, and the tower opens. The gavel of Heimer inside summons a great magical hammer for a sweeping overhead smash, a sorcery so unusual in its melee sorcery delivery that many players who finally reach it have forgotten how long the puzzle took. The gesture and the reward both feel like they arrived from a different game entirely. Thops and the Bell Bearing. Sorcerer. Thops sits in the Church of Erith in Leonia, a gentle scholar who has been locked out of the academy he once studied in and would very much like a glintstone key to return. He sells a small selection of spells and is easy to overlook as a minor vendor. If you give him a spare academy glintstone key, a second one can be found within Raya Lucaria itself. He thanks you and disappears, making his way back. When you eventually find him inside the academy on a specific wooden bench, he has not survived the return trip. He is dead, still clutching the key, with his bell bearing resting beside him. The bell bearing, given to the twin maiden husks at the Round Table Hold, restores access to his entire spell inventory. Players who kill him forget to buy his spells, or simply miss the bell bearing step lose access to those spells permanently for that playthrough. He is one of those quiet, breakable parts of Elden Ring where a small oversight carries a lasting consequence. The crystal staff behind the wall. Academy Crystal Cave is a dungeon directly west of Raya Lucaria, accessible after a brief swamp crossing. Its boss is two Crystallians, crystalline enemies who absorb magic damage and demand physical or strike attacks. After the boss room, a ladder leads to the rooftop and the Terra Magica chest. But there is a second treasure in this dungeon that almost nobody finds without guidance. Just before the boss fog gate, a room off to the right appears to end at a blank wall. The wall is illusory. Strike it, pass through, and the chest inside holds the crystal staff. A sorcery catalyst requiring 48 intelligence that provides a 10% boost to Crystallian sorceries. The crystal staff's raw damage scaling is unremarkable, but the path to it requires noticing an illusory wall that most players walk past because they are focused on the fog gate ahead. Among all the hidden items in the game, this one is organically missed even by experienced players, simply because attention naturally shifts toward the obvious destination. The Arrow's Reach Talisman for Sorcerers. The Arrow's Reach Talisman is listed in its item description as increasing the range of arrow attacks, and most players associate it entirely with bow users. There is one sorcery it also affects, and the overlap is easy to miss. Rock Sling, the gravity sorcery that launches 3 boulders at physical damage targets, has its effective range extended by this talisman. The boulders travel farther before distance fall-off reduces their threat. This does not increase the damage the boulders deal, and the talisman does nothing for any other sorcery in the game. But for players who use Rock Sling for its stance-breaking physical damage against magic-resistant targets, the ability to start those boulders flying from farther away can make a meaningful difference in how early you begin chipping a boss's stance without closing into dangerous proximity. It is one of the game's more eccentric single sorcery interactions, hiding in an item description that gives no visible indication of this specific relationship. The Meteorite of Astel Deep Dive. Meteorite of Astel is one of the most visually striking sorceries in the game. A rain of small meteorites that shower down on a wide area in the target zone, dealing both physical and magic damage across multiple hits. It requires 55 intelligence, marking it as an endgame sorcery, and it drops from a specific encounter, Astel, Stars of Darkness, found inside the Yeluf Annex tunnel in the consecrated snowfield. A separate Astel encounter from the one beneath the Lake of Rot within Rani's quest line. This second Astel is easy to miss because the consecrated snowfield is already optional and the tunnel leading to the boss is unmarked. The spell rewards the exploration. It deals split physical and magic damage, benefits from the meteorite staff's gravity passive held in your offhand, and against large slow bosses that cannot evade the descending rain, it delivers several consecutive hits per cast that accumulate into considerable total damage. You have to find an Astel that most players never meet to unlock it. Wing of Astel and the intelligence weapon. Most players associate the Wing of Astel with gravity-themed builds that match its cosmic origin. The curved sword drops from Astel, natural born of the void beneath the Lake of Rot, and its unique weapon art Nebula fires magic stars in a spreading arc. But Wing of Astel scales primarily with intelligence. And on a high intelligence character, it becomes one of the cleaner melee weapon options for a sorcerer who wants a physical backup without sacrificing their stat investment. The Nebula weapon art fires over a wide area, dealing magic damage at close to medium range, and it benefits from all the standard intelligence scaling magic damage boosts. Magic Scorpion Charm, Graven Mass, Terra Magica. On a 70+ intelligence character, the weapon art alone can clear groups or punish a boss's recovery window without requiring you to shift mental gears from caster to physical attacker. It is Astel's own limb turned against him, which carries a quiet satisfaction that the weapon's description never directly acknowledges. The Carrion Sorcery Sword's offhand cast. The Carrion Sorcery Sword is a straight sword that also functions as a spellcasting catalyst. Held in the offhand and pressing the strong attack button, fires a sorcery from the sword directly. The same sorceries you would cast from a staff, but routed through a weapon that can also swing in melee. For a build that wants to close distance and alternate between physical sword strikes in the main hand and spell casts from the sword catalyst in the offhand, it removes the need to weapon swap at all. The sorcery scaling on the Carrion Sorcery Sword is not competitive with dedicated staffs at high intelligence, which limits it as a pure casting implement, but as a dual threat piece of equipment for a battle mage approach, physical in the right hand, spells routing through the offhand sword. It creates a fluid combat experience that no other item replicates. It is found in a chest inside the Carrion Study Hall, the elegant tilted tower in eastern Leonia. The Dark Moon Greatsword's secret projectile, completing Rani's entire quest line, rewards you with the Dark Moon Greatsword, found beneath the Cathedral of Manoceles after delivering the Dark Moon Ring to Rani. The sword scales with intelligence and dexterity, and its unique Ash of War, Moonlight Greatsword, charges the blade with frost magic before releasing a sweeping slash that fires a large blue crescent projectile. At high intelligence, 70 or above, the projectile from this weapon art deals damage, comparable to or exceeding several mid-tier offensive sorceries, and it costs no FP. The weapon art runs on a cooldown rather than being FP gated, for a build that runs FP low during extended boss fights and needs a reliable damage option that does not touch the blue bar. Swapping to a charged Moonlight Greatsword, slash fires meaningful magic damage at no resource cost. It is the ultimate argument for the spell sword hybrid, a weapon that steps in during the FP dry window and covers the gap, while your sorcery resources recover. Moonveil's transient moonlight. The Moonveil katana became notable shortly after Elden Ring's release for its weapon art. Transient moonlight. The strong version of the ash fires a horizontal wave of blue magic energy that deals split magic and physical damage in a wide arc. On a high intelligence character, the magic portion is boosted by all standard intelligence scaling modifiers, and the speed of the attack leaves very little response time. For a sorcery build that carries Moonveil as a secondary weapon, Transient Moonlight does not require FP investment or spell slot management. It is a weapon skill, separate from the sorcery system, but it reads the same intelligence stat, powering your sorceries and hits with comparable force. Players who built pure sorcery runs and never picked up Moonveil sometimes discover this interaction late and find that the katana resolves a class of problems. Fast-moving enemies at close range, aggressive PvP pressure that sorceries struggle with without asking anything new from the build's existing investment. Cold Infusion and the Intelligence Melee. The Cold Infusion Wet Blade is found in the freezing lake area of the mountaintops of the giants, and once you have it, any compatible physical weapon can be given. Cold Affinity, replacing its standard damage scaling with a configuration that adds intelligence scaling alongside frostbite buildup. A cold-infused weapon on a high intelligence character deals its native physical damage amplified by intelligence, while accumulating frostbite with each hit. This creates a hybrid loop where the weapon itself functions as the frostbite applicator, proccing the status and opening the vulnerability window, while your spells capitalize on the debuffed state. The entire frostbite setup costs no spell slots and no FP. It happens through normal weapon swings, leaving the sorcery loadout fully available for the follow-up burst. It is the most resource-efficient frostbite cycle available to an intelligence build, because the setup half is entirely off the sorcery system. Rancorcal and the late game reveal. Rancorcal is a death sorcery that fires a spreading wave of small skull projectiles, all of which individually track toward the nearest enemy and converge. In the early and mid-game, against enemies with meaningful flat defense, each skull deals disappointingly low damage, and the spell gets shelved quickly. Most players never return to it. The reason it becomes viable very late involves the flat defense system. Enemies in endgame areas like Varamazula and the mountaintops have high HP, but their flat defense values become proportionally smaller relative to spells whose base damage has climbed with your intelligence and sorcery scaling. At 80 intelligence casting Rancorcal in the late game, the accumulated damage from multiple converging skulls is dramatically higher than the same spell performed in Limgrave. Ancient Death Rancor, the stronger version requiring 34 intelligence and 24 faith, fires a denser and more aggressive barrage that becomes one of the better mid-range sustained options for the Death Sorcery school in endgame encounters. A reward for patient players who held onto the school when it seemed weak. Freezing Mist and the Patrol Trap. Freezing Mist is sold by Preceptor Seluvis for 7,500 runes and requires 21 intelligence. It releases a slow-drifting cloud of freezing vapor directly in front of the caster, which lingers in place and builds frostbite on any enemy that stands inside it. Most players test it, find that bosses who move constantly will clear of it immediately, and conclude it is situational at best. The correct use is topographical, in narrow corridors, choke points, doorways, and spaces where enemies must pass through a specific zone to reach you. Freezing mist cast into that space functions as a passive frostbite accumulator. You cast, step back, and let the enemy walk into it. Boss enemies with looping patrol patterns, particularly those in catacomb mini-dungeons, sometimes cycle through a freezing mist zone repeatedly, proccing frostbite on their own movement, without you doing anything further. In those moments, it becomes the most FP-efficient frostbite source in the game because you cast it once and the enemy does the rest. Scholar's Shield, the Forgotten Defense. Most sorceries in Elden Ring are either offensive or offensive adjacent, utility spells that support your damage output rather than protect you from incoming harm. Scholar's Shield is a genuine exception that almost never gets mentioned. It enchants your left-hand shield with a significant boost to magic absorption for the duration, making that shield dramatically more effective against the sorcery-heavy enemies that appear throughout the Academy, the Eternal Cities, and the late-game areas where magical damage is the primary threat. It requires only 12 intelligence, costs 14 FP, and can be cast while moving. In encounters against Renala's Phase 1 summoned sorcerer phantoms, the blue-robed scholars of Raya Lucaria, or any enemy that pelts you with glintstone projectiles, a Scholar's Shield buffed Carian Knight Shield absorbs a level of magical pressure that would otherwise chip your HP constantly. It is the most underused support sorcery in the game by a considerable margin, a spell that solves a real problem, sold cheaply by a vendor most players visit, never purchased because nobody thinks to look for it. Lucidity and the Madness Zones. There are specific areas in Elden Ring where being caught without a plan for status management is genuinely dangerous. The Frenzied Flame prescription deep beneath Lendel, the Mogwin Palace approach, and certain encounters in the DLC all accumulate madness or sleep build-up rapidly through environment and enemy abilities. Lucidity is the sorcery solution. It requires only 15 intelligence, costs a modest amount of FP, and immediately purges both sleep and madness build-up by a fixed amount. For sorcery builds that encounter these areas and would normally scramble for consumable items, Lucidity addresses the problem from the spell wheel without consuming inventory space or requiring menu management mid-fight. It is sold by Preceptor Seluvis and sits unremarkably among his other wares. Most players scroll past it, buy nothing, and then curse themselves later when they watch the madness bar fill up with no clean answer equipped. Among all the spells the game sells cheaply and ignores thereafter, Lucidity is the one most likely to prevent a death in a specific and memorable way. The Malekith approach, Malekith, the Black Blade, is one of the game's most movement-intensive bosses. A creature that leaps and vaults across the arena almost continuously, spending so little time grounded that traditional sorcery setups struggle to find clean cast windows. His Phase 2 involves attacks that cover enormous arena distances in single jumps, making it feel designed to punish range casters who need a moment to aim. Two sorceries handle him effectively through different mechanisms. Shard Spiral, cast during one of his brief landing moments, sends its spiraling twin bolts into him and continues dealing tick damage as they pass through his body, while he is already moving toward his next attack. The bolts do not need to track his movement because they persist through his hitbox. Night Comet, Chain Cast, during the gaps between his aggression bursts, connects because his AI does not register it Antonis as incoming and never performs the sidestep that dodges conventional projectiles. Between the two, a patient sorcerer can maintain meaningful pressure through one of the most hostile attack patterns in the base game. Astel and the magic immunity problem. Astel, Natural Born of the Void, is the most magic-resistant major boss in the base game. a gravitational entity from a falling star who absorbs the very element that defines most intelligence, builds primary damage type. Standard sorcery damage against Astel is meaningfully reduced, and no combination of Magic Scorpion Charm, Graven Mass Talisman, and Terra Magica can fully compensate for a fundamental resistance. This is where Rock Sling and Physical Gravity sorceries become the answer rather than the backup. Astel takes full physical damage, making Rock Sling's boulders connect at expected strength. The Meteorite Staff's gravity bonus from the offhand still applies to Rock Sling, making the dual staff technique genuinely worthwhile against him specifically. Meteorite of Astel, if obtained, also bypasses the magic immunity partially through its split damage type. The encounter is one of the moments in the game where knowing the distinction between gravity sorceries and standard glintstone magic changes the fight from a grinding frustration into a manageable engagement. Radon's second phase and the Terra Magica window. Star Scourge. Radon's Phase 2 opens with the most dramatic boss entrance in the game. He launches himself into space and descends as a meteor directly at your location, and the impact covers a wide area with enormous damage on a direct hit. But that atmospheric descent is also a window. If you cast Terra Magica in a safe corner of the arena during the descent and then position inside the sigil before he lands, you absorb the initial chaos while standing in your 35% magic boost circle for the entirety of his second phase. Given how often Radon holds position during his second phase compared to his first, and how well-ranged sorceries exploit the medium-distance gaps between his rotational attack patterns, entering Phase 2 already standing inside Terra Magica is a discipline that experienced sorcerers practice as a deliberate opening gambit. The meteor entrance that most players treat as pure panic is, with preparation, a reliable setup window that rewards composure. Renala's second phase and the immunity note. Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, seems like a natural target for a frostbite-heavy build. She is cold, her sorceries are ice-themed, and her visual language suggests an affinity with cold magic. The important note is that her second phase is fully immune to frostbite status. Adler's Moonblade, Glintstone Ice Crag, Rani's Dark Moon's frostbite build-up. None of it procs the status on her. However, the 10% magic damage debuff from either full moon sorcery still applies when the spell lands, because that debuff is separate from the frostbite proc itself. A sorcerer who opens with either Rani's Dark Moon or Renala's Full Moon against her still receives the vulnerability window from the debuff hit. The frostbite build-up simply does nothing in this fight. This distinction matters when building your spell sequence. Bring your debuffing opener for the resistance reduction. Leave the dedicated frostbite cycle spells for enemies who can actually be affected by the status. Placidusax and the Spiral Demolition. Dragon Lord Placidusax is the secret optional boss of Faramazula, found by lying in a specific oval depression on a high-altitude platform and teleporting into a storm-ringed arena where a two-headed dragon made of lightning and gold waits. He's enormous. That scale is both his visual spectacle and his structural vulnerability when confronted with Shard Spiral, the spell's twin bolts, which pass through a target dealing repeated damage instances for their full travel duration. Find in Placidusax a hitbox so massive that the bolts spend virtually their entire range traveling through him rather than past him. Against a standard-sized boss, many of those potential hit instances exit the hitbox mid-travel. Against Placidusax, his sheer size ensures the bolts stay inside the target for far longer, maximizing damage per cast. Players who discovered this reported eliminating him faster than almost any other method available, without any of the setup complexity that Comet Aza demands. You cast Shard Spiral, and the ancient dragon simply runs out of health. The Elden Beast and the tracking arsenal. The Elden Beast is the final boss of the base game, an enormous cosmic creature that serves as the physical embodiment of the Elden Ring itself, drifting across a wide arena of shallow water surrounded by stars. Its constant lateral movement means that sorceries with a straight travel line frequently sail through the space where it just was. Two sorceries address this in opposite directions. Stars of Ruin fires 12 individually tracking projectiles that each compute an independent arc toward the target. The Elden Beast's drift is handled automatically by the spell's flight geometry. Shard Spiral, if you close distance enough to fire it directly into the creature's body, deals its full multiple hit potential during the drift phases when it stays relatively still. Night Comet chain cast at medium range bypasses the dodge response that the Elden Beast applies to some projectiles. The fight rewards sorcerers who have assembled a diverse enough spell kit that no movement pattern the Elden Beast adopts can simultaneously negate everything they carry. Millennia and the two reliable tools. Millennia. Blade of Miquella is widely considered the hardest boss in the game, and sorcery builds face a specific challenge approaching her. She dodges conventional sorcery projectiles with a responsiveness that feels almost prescient. Standard Comet, Glintstone Pebble, Rock Sling. She sidesteps all of them with the casual ease of someone who has done this more times than any player. Night Comet is the first answer, exploiting the fundamental AI gap she shares with all other enemies. She never registers the invisible projectile as a dodge trigger and absorbs every cast cleanly. Magic Glintblade is the second, relying on its delayed fire tracking to connect during whatever recovery frame she presents. These two spells, one that flies invisibly, one that fires after a lag and tracks, give a sorcerer two reliable damage options that her dodge response cannot address. She will still heal from your projectiles if she lands a hit, which requires maintaining distance from her melee reach. But the sorcery tools to beat her exist clearly in the game's spell roster, assembled and ready. The Godskin Noble and the Mist setup. The Godskin Noble appears in multiple locations throughout Elden Ring. At the Temple of Igle inside Volcano Manor, at the Divine Tower of Liurnia, and as one half of the Godskin duo. In solo encounters, his rolling belly attack and his stretched snakeform dive are the primary threats for ranged builds. Night Maiden's Mist cast into his patrol space before triggering his aggression, or during a moment when he is recovering from a roll, deals continuous tick damage that he does not respond to with a dodge or special evasion. His movement speed is low enough during standing patrol phases that the mist lingers in the space he occupies for multiple tick cycles before he walks clear. Against the noble specifically in solo encounters, where the chaos of the duo fight is absent, the mist strategy is particularly clean. You cast it, step back, and watch his health bar decline while you wait for the next safe opportunity to repeat. Collapsing Stars as a combo opener. Collapsing Stars fires an orb of gravitational energy that detonates and draws everything caught in its radius toward a central point. It deals magic damage, benefits from the meteorite staff's gravity passive in the offhand, and can be charged for the Godfrey Icon's damage bonus. The pull mechanic is where it functions as something more than a standard damage spell. When Collapsing Stars lands on a group of enemies, they cluster together for a moment. any AoE sorcery cast immediately after hits all of them in the concentrated zone. Glintstone Arc, Crystal Burst, or a second Collapsing Stars can catch the entire group while they are still recovering from the pull. In corridors and open areas with multiple enemies, this combination turns what would be a sequential engagement into a single compound burst. The pull also repositions enemies that were behind cover or at awkward angles, bringing them into clean line of sight for your follow-up cast. It is a gravity sorcery that functions as battlefield control first and a damage source second. The Carrion Sorcery Sword and Fluid Combat. The Carrion Sorcery Sword's spellcasting function activates through the strong attack input, while the sword is in your offhand. A character wielding any weapon in the main hand can fire sorceries from the sword without weapon swapping, without menu access, and without drawing a staff. The sorcery launches from the sword point as if cast normally, using whatever spell is currently selected. For a build that alternates between melee damage from the main hand and spells from the offhand at close quarters, sometimes called the Spellblade approach, the Carrion Sorcery Sword removes all friction from that rotation. One button fires melee, another fires spells, no pause. The scaling is not optimal, but for a hybrid build that spreads damage between weapon hits and sorceries rather than focusing purely on spell output, the fluidity of execution compensates for what the raw numbers lose. The sword is in a chest inside the Carrion Study Hall, the elegant tilted tower in eastern Liurnia, waiting for players who want their magic and their melee to arrive without interruption. Loretta's Mastery and the 4-Arrow Gap. Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, at the top of Miquella's Haligtree, moves faster and hits harder than her Carrier Mana version. Her reward reflects the escalation. Loretta's Mastery fires 4 great magical arrows simultaneously in a wide spread from a spectral greatbow, compared to the single arrow of Loretta's greatbow. The practical challenge is that the 4 arrows spread outward from the central aim point. At close range, they converge and all 4 land. At long range, the spread fans enough that only 1 or 2 connect reliably. The optimal distance is roughly mid-range against a large target. Against dragons, large beast bosses, and enemies that occupy wide horizontal hitboxes, all 4 arrows can connect at the distance where the spread is still tight enough to land across the target's full body width. Each arrow deals substantial individual damage, and all 4 landings simultaneously represents one of the higher single cast damage numbers available in the entire sorcery repertoire. It is a spell that rewards reading the geometry of your target before committing the FP. Intelligence soft caps in practice. The intelligence stat follows a scaling curve that most players hear referenced as soft caps, without fully understanding what the curve looks like in practice. The first meaningful threshold for sorcery scaling sits at 60 intelligence. Below this, each point added makes a noticeable difference. Between 60 and 80, gains continue but are more modest per level. Still worth pursuing for a dedicated caster. Beyond 80 intelligence, returns diminish sharply. The difference between 80 and 99 intelligence on sorcery scaling is roughly equivalent to the difference between 70 and 80, achieved with 19 additional levels rather than 10. For most players, 60 intelligence is the baseline where a sorcery build starts to feel effective. 80 is the sweet spot where the build reaches its peak practical output, and anything above 80 is diminishing returns territory that only makes sense after every other priority stat has been addressed. Reaching 80 intelligence and 40 vigor handles essentially every sorcery encounter in the game without meaningful deficiency in either damage or survivability. The Glintstone Pebble Efficiency Secret. Glintstone Pebble is the astrologer's starting spell and one of the first available for purchase in the game. It costs 7 FP and deals a single hit of magic damage. Players who have spent hours with more powerful sorceries sometimes forget to revisit it and appreciate what it actually represents. The best damage to FP ratio of any Glintstone sorcery in the game. At high intelligence, with a maxed sorcery scaling staff, a Glintstone Pebble deals nearly as much per hit as significantly more expensive sorceries, because the spell formula scales efficiently with your sorcery scaling number. The situations where Pebble falls behind are ones involving very large hitboxes, where Shard Spiral's multi-hit outperforms it, or aggressive movement, where Stars of Ruin's tracking handles what Pebble cannot aim at quickly enough. Against the standard single-target enemy with no special vulnerability, Glintstone Pebble Chaincast at high intelligence and full buff stack is one of the most FP sustainable damage options available. It has been quietly optimal since the start of the game, for a reason that takes many hours to fully appreciate. Gravitational Missile and the Pull combo. Shadow of the Erdtree's Gravitational Missile fires a convex energy projectile that pulls any enemy it strikes towards your position. The pull is more immediate and precise than Gravity Well's broader gravitational field. It yanks a single target directly across the air to you with a snapping force. For builds that want to close the gap on enemies who maintain distance, it reverses the dynamic entirely. You become the anchor and the enemy becomes the object in motion. The spell requires 42 intelligence and is available from a vendor in the DLC region. Its primary elegance is the setup it creates. Pull an enemy from distance into melee range, immediately follow with Carian Slicer chaincasts at point blank, and the entire engagement takes place on your terms. In the DLC's more open terrain, where enemies can keep considerable distance, Gravitational Missile makes aggressive melee sorcery viable in a way that the base game's tighter corridors do not always support. The spell treats distance not as safety, but as material. Blades of Stone and the Stance game. Blades of Stone, added in Shadow of the Erdtree, summons a series of crystalline blades from the ground that erupt upward in a line extending from your position. Each blade that connects with an enemy deals split physical and magic damage, and contributes meaningfully to stance damage. The poise-breaking accumulation that triggers a critical hit window when filled, for a sorcery build that wants to break enemy stances without investing in heavy strike weapons or poise-focused Ashes of War. Blades of Stone handles the stance damage component through spell casts alone. It pairs well with Great Blade Phalanx overhead drops, which also deal above average stance damage, creating a 2-spell stance damage combination that can stagger even resilient bosses through accumulated poise pressure. The spell requires 40 intelligence and is found in the DLC's later areas, positioning it as a late-game toolkit addition rather than an early acquisition. The Staff of the Guilty and Bleed Sorcery. The Staff of the Guilty arrived in Shadow of the Erdtree as the dedicated catalyst for a build archetype that had never existed in the base game. It is a sorcery staff that provides a passive boost to sorceries that build bleed, and it scales with both intelligence and faith in a way that supports hybrid investment. The spell it was designed around, Impenetrable Thorns, builds bleed rapidly at minimal FP cost and delivers its damage through the bleed proc mechanic, rather than direct magic damage. When combined with the Albinauric staff in the offhand for its arcane scaling boost to bleed sorceries, the result is a character who casts spells from a staff and relies on bleed as their primary damage source. It is structurally identical to a blood melee build, but the damage arrives through spell animations rather than weapon swings. The Staff of the Guilty is found in the Land of Shadow's early accessible areas, signaling from the start of the expansion that this new archetype is intentional and rewarded. Miriam's vanishing in the boss arena. Miriam's vanishing is best understood as a positional tool rather than a damage spell. It costs FP, deals no damage, and from a raw efficiency standpoint, looks wasteful compared to simply rolling. The distinction between rolling and Miriam's vanishing is the target lock break. When a boss locks onto you, its AI maintains that lock and directs follow-up attacks towards your position. A standard dodge roll does not break this targeting. Miriam's vanishing briefly drops you from the boss's targeting system, creating a moment where its attack AI has no confirmed location for you. In the instant of reacquisition, the boss must re-establish your position, producing a slightly longer window before the next attack sequence begins. Against bosses with extremely aggressive follow-up chains that allow very little time between attacks, that window can be exactly the size of a safe cast animation. The spell is obtained by defeating Preceptus, Miriam in the inverted Carrion Study Hall, a boss tied to the Study Hall's questline mechanic, found by those who read every note in the tower carefully. The Beloved Stardust Talisman. The DLC's Beloved Stardust Talisman joins the Radagon icon as the second item in the game that addresses casting speed without requiring dexterity investment. Where the Radagon icon grants 30 virtual dexterity toward casting speed, the Beloved Stardust's effect reaches the 70 dexterity hard cap for casting speed entirely on its own, regardless of your actual dexterity stat. The cost is increased incoming damage, making it a more aggressive trade-off than the Radagon icon, but also more complete in what it provides. For a build that has invested 0 points into dexterity and wants maximum casting speed across every spell in the game, equipping the Beloved Stardust achieves the full casting speed ceiling without additional items. The talisman is obtained from Count Emir at the Cathedral of Manus. Meteor, rewarded for progressing his questline by exploring the finger ruins he directs you toward. It is one of the DLC's more quietly powerful caster rewards, changing the feel of every spell in your kit with a single talisman slot commitment. Relana and her moons. Relana is the Twin Moon Knight, a boss encountered early in Shadow of the Erdtree's main progression, wielding one fire sword and one magic sword in a dual blade style that demands respect for her range and speed. Her remembrance, exchanged at the Round Table Hold with Enya, offers either her twin blades as a weapon or her signature sorcery, Relana's Twin Moons. The sorcery conjures two enormous luminous moons that hover briefly before being driven simultaneously downward, erupting in a wide area of magic damage. The casting time is long enough that landing it safely requires a clear committed opening, a phase transition, the recovery window after a heavy attack, or a spirit summon holding full aggro. Against slower enemies or in PvP situations where a deliberate opening can be constructed through baiting, Relana's Twin Moons delivers among the highest damage single-cast sorceries in the entire game. The Carrion Regal Scepter's 10% boost to full moon sorceries applies. Both moons landing on a target that cannot evade the overlapping detonation area is one of the most satisfying outcomes any sorcery in the game can produce. The talisman multiplication, how it actually works. Most players understand intuitively that damage boosts stack in Elden Ring's sorcery system, but the difference between additive stacking and multiplicative stacking produces very different results. When multiple percentage damage boosts apply simultaneously, they multiply against each other rather than summing. If you have the Graven School Talisman at 4%, the Graven Mass Talisman at 8%, the Magic Scorpion Charm at 12%, and Terra Magica at 35%. Those numbers do not simply add to 59%. Instead, each multiplier applies in sequence against the previous product, and the effective total boost lands around 74% above your base damage, significantly more than a flat addition would produce. This is why experienced sorcerers discuss their setups in terms of the multiplicative stack, rather than listing individual percentages. Each new modifier you add compounds against the existing product. Adding a 10% modifier to a build that already has 3 strong multipliers creates more than 10% additional final damage. Understanding this changes which modifiers you prioritize and which talisman slot you fill last. The Celian Sealbreaker Key. After obtaining Comet Azur from Primeval Sorcerer, Azur on Mount Gelmir, speaking with Sorcerer Selen, and exhausting her dialogue prompts her to give you the Celian Sealbreaker, a special key that opens the magical barrier concealing Lusat's location in Celia Hideaway. Players following Selen's questline pick this up naturally, but players who find Azur's location independently and claim Comet Azur without being on her questline may not know to return to her afterward. The Sealbreaker is specifically required to reach Lusat. Without it, a barrier in Celia Hideaway blocks the path with no indication of what item would open it. Inside the chamber beyond the barrier, Lusat sits in the same preserved, petrified state as Azur, and speaking with him rewards stars of ruin directly. 2 legendary sorceries, 2 petrified sorcerers, each guarding the other's signature spell. Comet Azur from Azur unlocks the path to Stars of Ruin from Lusat. The 2 primeval figures of Elden Ring's sorcery tradition are linked even in how you collect what they left behind. Fear's Mist and the Death Blight Bypass. Fear's Mist is one of the more unusual sorceries in the game. A Death Blight cloud that drifts forward slowly and accumulates the Death Blight status on enemies it contacts. Death Blight is a rare status effect that, when it fills completely, kills the affected target outright, regardless of remaining HP. It is not effective against most bosses, who are immune to instant kill status effects by design. But against standard enemies and specific non-boss encounters, it bypasses the need to reduce HP entirely. The sorcery requires completing Fear's questline in Deeproot Depths, an optional area only accessible after defeating the Valiant Gargoyle boss and using the coffin at the base of the waterfall in Nokron, Eternal City. Fear's questline involves a conversation-heavy arc that culminates in a revelation about what she has been carrying and why she sought the Tarnished's embrace so many times. The mist is her parting gift, and like Fear herself, it approaches death from a direction the game's standard combat system never considers. The Glintblade Trap for ambushing invaders. For players who engage in Elden Ring's invasion and co-op multiplayer systems, a specific sorcery combination creates an ambush setup built on the delay mechanics of the Glintblade family. Carrion Phalanx orbits you and fires reactively. Magic Glintblade and Glintblade Trio, both delay fire tracking swords that circle briefly before launching. An invader who approaches sees you apparently standing still. No projectile in the air, no visible threat traveling toward them. The Phalanx swords orbit quietly. The Glintblade trio already cast is circling, waiting. The moment an invader closes to the phalanx's trigger range, multiple delayed swords all fire simultaneously from different angles. The reactive phalanx, the trio, and any Great Blade phalanx shots overhead converging at once. It is an ambush built entirely from sorceries that appear passive until the instant they are not. Built from the natural aggression of players who approach without caution and step into a field of delayed fire they never saw being prepared. The Carolus Crown and the Hidden +3. Raya Lucaria is full of optional collectibles hidden in corners and behind illusory walls. One of the more useful and easily overlooked items is the Carolus Glintstone Crown, found on a giant lobster enemy near the debate parlor in the Academy, the same area where the Red Wolf of Radagon fight takes place. The Carolus Crown provides a passive bonus of +3 to intelligence. 3 points of intelligence is not a dramatic shift for a character who has already invested 60 or more levels into the stat. But for a character sitting just below a spell requirement, needing 63 intelligence for a threshold of 65, the crown covers the gap without spending 2 additional levels. It is also the crown required to perform the erudition gesture at the converted Fringe Tower to unlock the Gavel of Heimer, meaning it has a specific puzzle application entirely separate from its stats. Wearing it to check a requirement, solve a puzzle, and then swap back to a better helm is a practical piece of inventory management that never stops being useful on an intelligence build. The double Astal and the Stellar drops. There are 2 separate Astal bosses in Elden Ring, and distinguishing between them matters for spell hunting. The first, Astal, Natural Born of the Void, is encountered beneath the Lake of Rot during Ranni's questline, found by following the underground waterway south from Noxtella, Eternal City. This version drops the wing of Astel curved sword. The second, Astel, Stars of Darkness, is found inside the yellow Annex tunnel in the consecrated snowfield, an entirely optional late-game area accessible only after obtaining both halves of the Haligtree medallion and reaching the snowfield via the grand Lift of Rold's secret route. This second Astal drops Meteorite of Astel. Both versions are formidable, but the second is harder to find simply because it requires following an optional path deep into the game's most remote region. Players who finish the game without ever knowing the consecrated snowfield exists sometimes discover afterward that there was an entire Astal they never met, and a gravity sorcery they never obtained. Comet Azur's channel behavior. Comet Azur functions differently from most sorceries in a subtle but important way. Most spells are cast on button press. Press, the animation plays, the spell fires, you regain control. Comet Azur begins its animation on button press, but continues dealing damage as long as you hold the button down. This is not a charge version. It is a channeled beam that fires continuously while held, draining FP at a steady rate per second. The moment you release the button, or your FP hits 0, the beam ends. When you combine this with the Cerulean Hidden Tears FP-free window, the beam channels for the full duration without touching your FP bar, and Lusar's staff fired through that window generates the highest per second burst damage available in the game for a brief, precious span. The window is everything. The entire Comet Azur setup architecture exists for the sole purpose of creating and maximizing that window, and the satisfaction of watching a boss health bar disappear inside it never diminishes no matter how many times it happens. The full moon debuff duration. Both Renala's full moon and Ranni's dark moon apply magic damage debuffs on hit. Both increase magic damage taken by 10%, though the duration needs knowing precisely. The debuff lasts for roughly 60 full seconds from the moment it connects. 60 seconds is an extremely long window in combat terms. Most boss fights cycle through their entire pattern library significantly faster than that. The key difference between the two moons is not the debuff percentage, which is the same, but the frostbite. Rani's Dark Moon also inflicts frostbite buildup, and if frostbite procs simultaneously, the two debuffs stack multiplicatively for a combined magic vulnerability that is meaningfully higher. Opening a boss fight with either moon, then spending the following minute casting lower FP sorceries that all hit harder because of the active debuff, is the mathematically sound use of the spell. And very few players deploy it this deliberately. They cast it for direct damage, find the damage underwhelming relative to cost, and move on without understanding what they paid for. The players who grasp its architecture cast it once to open, and spend 60 seconds collecting the return on that investment through every cast that follows. The Founding Rain of Stars usage. Founding Rain of Stars is the legendary sorcery that most confuses players despite its label. It requires 52 intelligence, fires a cloud of star projectiles in a wide falling area, and looks like it should demolish anything it touches. In practice, its strength is crowd size and target movement speed. Against a single fast-moving boss, the rain pelts the ground, and the boss walks clear between hits. Against a group of slow or stationary enemies standing in a concentrated area, the Haligtree Tree avatars, soldiers corralled by collapsing stars, enemies funneled into a choke point. It becomes one of the most efficient AO. E clearing options available to an intelligence build. The insight is that Founding Rain of Stars is not a single target boss killer. It is a field clearing sweep against targets the game places in groups, and that lack the mobility to escape a falling star pattern. Against those specific enemies, the legendary designation earns its name completely. The Primeval Current and what it means, Comet Azur and Stars of Ruin. Both carry item descriptions that reference the Primeval Current, a concept sitting at the edge of the game's sorcery lore and touching the motivation behind both Lusat and Azur's departure. From the Academy of Raya Lucaria. Both were conspectus, senior scholars, who glimpsed something beyond normal sorcery scholarship, described as seeing the current of stars itself. The experience permanently changed them, pulling them away from the Academy and eventually into the petrified states where you find them. The spells they left behind represent what they saw translated into castable form. Comet Azur's endless channeled beam reaching outward. Stars of Ruin's 12 homing bolts guided as if by an invisible current. The decision to make their most powerful spells mechanically unusual, rather than simply stronger versions of existing sorceries, feels deliberate. These are not upgrades. They are the primeval current in gesture, preserved in 2 spell slots long after the sorcerers who touched that current became part of it.